Working Cows Podcast, episode 394. This episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Conry, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios, and this episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag. We've been fortunate to feature a number of Understanding Ag's regenerative farming and ranching experts on the podcast over the years. In that time, Understanding Ag's reputation for helping producers understand and successfully and profitably apply money-saving regenerative principles and practices has only grown. And there are two primary reasons for that. First, Understanding Ag's consultants are farmers and ranchers who've been there, done that on their own regenerative farms. And second, Understanding Ag's consultants aren't in the business to sell you costly inputs. They get no commissions and you get no pressure. Just profit-building solutions for your operation. Learn more at understandingag.com and discover the hope in healthy soil. That's www.understandingag.com. Very excited to be joined today once again by Kent Donica. Kent is a guy who made his living working with stocker cattle, buying, selling cattle, using a lot of the marketing principles that we learned from the likes of Bud Williams. And he is also a consultant with Understanding Ag and has taught a marketing school for Understanding Ag numerous times. So very much appreciate the opportunity to chat with him again, especially given the current season that we are in. So Kent, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast. Welcome back.
Yes, sir. It's good to be back.
Yeah, well, it's fall again, right? And marketing is on people's minds. And I always think it's good to strike while the iron's hot, and maybe if we can't change what they're doing this year, we can set them up to make a better decision next year, maybe. So let's just kind of set the stage a little bit and talk about kind of how you think about marketing, especially at this time of year, and what you're hoping to accomplish.
Well, you know, I would start off with a good marketing plan is kind of like a good drought plan. You need to do it before it's time. I can't improve on that. I mean, if you wait till the 3rd of November, a lot of places are probably frosted. A lot of places are going to get some. That's a lot of people's, the old calendar. Well, we sell the 15th of November, and they'll start looking, and I'm kind of waiting for people to start calling. Maybe the last time they checked, the market was July or August, and if you haven't looked at the market report since then, quite a bit of change. You're probably going to have some sticker shock. Probably going to be some people calling me, what happened to these calf prices? I thought these 6 weights were $3 a pound and now they're $2.40.
Yeah. I mean, and that is a good point, a good connection to where we're at right now is we've had some pretty high prices. I mean, we're still a long ways from a $1.50, even if we're not where we were, we're still a long ways from a $1.50 for a 6 weight calf. So, and I think contrary to popular belief, these things won't last forever. So what is your strategy as you come off of a market high? How are you thinking about what you're going to do as it starts to move downward? Because inevitably it will.
So number one, and to play the broken record again, you got to know your costs. They don't have to be 100%. I think a Schedule F is a horrible business plan. But you can look at how many calves you sold, how many pounds you sold, the shoebox. I think the reason a lot of people don't act more proactively is they have no idea what their costs are. Number one, so that's why they are obsessed with picking the market high, because if you pick the market high, it doesn't really matter if you made money or not. You can't do anything else. Yeah. And number one, know your costs. And number two, if this is more for I'm a yearling guy. Everybody knows that. But if you're a cow calf guy, maybe think, okay, what if we weaned them? What if we retained them for a little while? And all that I will say, I advise everybody I talk to, the second you separate that calf from his mother, you are in the stocker business, and it's a different frame of mind.
Hmm.
If you don't do anything, and I've healed up a lot of my home raised calves when it didn't really make me any money. This may step on a few toes, but I think we have something of an ethical obligation to give that calf the best chance to live good. And I'm going to heal him up, even if it costs me a little, if I don't get paid for it. And that being said, and for years, if it costs you $75 to precondition one, 60 days, just call point to point A to point B, you mark him to market. What will he bring if I hold him here? Maybe it doesn't make you a lot of money necessarily on the market, but somebody realized finally with where costs have went, these cattle are too cheap. And for 30 years, Clay, I wouldn't buy a preconditioned calf because that is what I was good at. And I finally woke up one day and I was like, who cares how good I am? It's still costing me, if it's costing me $100 a head for 60 days, and I can buy a preconditioned calf for 75 more, I just picked up $25. And so I started buying them. And I will say it on this, there's kind of an industry stigma that if you wean a calf for 60 days, he is bomb proof. And most of the time he is. But you need to remember the few times that he's not. Is it way better? Yes. Is it better on the calf? Yes. Will it make you money? And right now, they had a preconditioned sale in El Reno, Oklahoma, and similar weights. Most of those cattle were bringing $150 to $160 a head more than a calf marked unweaned. That you're leaving money on the table. The reason a lot of people don't, and I've had a lot of people say, man, you stole those calves. And I'm like, and my standard answer, I know, isn't it cool? Why did you let me? And the reason a lot of people don't is number one, kind of their paradigm or their head game. They don't want to, and that's fine. But if you don't want to do it, what is it? Doug Ferguson says, if you're going to run from the work, you just as well hide from the money.
Yeah, I had a guy one time tell me, you just find something that nobody wants to do, find a job nobody wants to do, and you can make good money doing that. And his example of that was honey wagons and outhouses at event venues. He said those people get paid pretty well to do that, and that's because nobody wants to mess with that. And so I think that
I'll shuck out the cash, but good for them. That's a good trade because we both think we're cheating the other one. But
yep.
The next reason a lot of people don't is, like we were talking before we started, they are stocked at or over capacity. They couldn't keep them if they wanted to, and some of them want to, and a lot of them don't. But I spoke to a group several years ago, and I said, look, I've made a living off of the mistakes that y'all made, and maybe it's as simple as just leaving money on the table. If the calf is too high, I'm not going to buy him. And if enough people think that, well, then the markets go down because there is one more seller than buyer, at least. And they go up because there is at least one more buyer. That's as simple as it gets.
Certainly. And, I think that's another thing that we come up against is we're doing it the way we've always done it. We've always taken the calves to town this week of the year, every year. And I think that happens to be, for most people, the same time of year when everybody else is taking calves to town. And so then you end up with that situation where you have one more or many more sellers than buyers. And, if you calve when everybody else does and you wean when everybody else does and you sell when everybody else does, then it's going to be really hard to differentiate yourself in that market. Is that part of what goes into succeeding with this?
Sure it is. Maybe hold them, ethical issues aside, and make no mistake, I did it for the cattle. I got a shirt several years ago for Christmas that said, I like cattle and maybe 3 people, and it applies. But if nothing else, you wean them the 1st of October, you're selling them the week before Thanksgiving. And that market generally does not go the week after Thanksgiving. 22 out of 25 years is better than the 10th of August. I used to tell my customers at the stockyards, if you have to wait in line more than 20 minutes, you're probably not going to like it. You show up here in the drive-in, the guys at the drive-in have been sitting there twiddling their thumbs. It's probably going to be a lot better than if you waited in line for 4 hours. It's simple. I think I said the last time I was on here, I refer to October as National Dead Calf Month. Everything gets harder and it gets more expensive. And that's as regular as October. And I can tell you, me and a lot of people that I know, we're not going to give you the 20th of October. It's, I guess, the 6th of November now. We've had days in the 80s and the 90s. It was dry. We got a rain, cooled off. I had a buddy call me 30 minutes ago, man, these calves tanked today. Well, I'm like, good luck. You know what's fixing to happen. I mean, I'm going to identify a cost on that. I'm not saying I won't buy a balling bull calf in October, but it's going to be at a substantial discount to what he was in August when it was way easier.
Yeah, and that goes back to knowing your costs, knowing your numbers, knowing what's it going to take me to get this calf to my house, get him straightened out, and get him to another point where I can sell him again, right?
Yep. And, and I think, too, maybe a lot of people, and we talk about this nearly ad nauseum in our marketing schools, is the value of gain. A lot of people would think, okay, so they're bringing $250 instead of $3. I'm still getting paid $250 a pound, or I can feed him for 30 days, and I'm going to get paid $250 a pound. So let's do it. Well, that's not how it works. Mm-hmm. It's pretty simple math, but if you know your feed, your variable cost of gain, feed and hay, little bit of labor, you can say, okay, this calf is going to gain, I'm going to put $2 a day in him and he's going to gain 2 pounds. Well, that's $1 a pound. People, they just don't do that math. And is it complicated? No. Is it complex? It's not really even complex.
Right. Yeah. It's just different. You just have to have that paradigm shift where you stop looking at the big number as applying to every pound that calf brought, because there were 600 pound calves that brought, this much. And now you've got this 750 pound calf that's going to bring that much. You only get paid for those extra 150 pounds, the amount, that's the difference. You got to do that math.
Dollar amount divided by the difference in weight.
Right.
And another thing is the seasonality. Everybody knows it's going to be hot in July. It's going to be cold in December, and it's probably most times going to rain in April. There is an equal seasonality to the market. I mean, and you said it, the reason a 500-pound calf probably tanks is there's enough of them get sold in late September and October that it kind of fills lots of things up. I mean, you take that same calf at 500, that's the low. And I mean, there's no outliers. The dots make the line. And the high on a 625-pound calf is the 1st of March. Why? Because everybody wants one. Got grass coming. I figured that early on. Thought, okay, if I buy a 3-weight in November and sell a big 5 in April, man, that deal's like Christmas most years. Everybody wants to sell at the high. But I don't think we spend enough time about thinking, okay, what if we didn't sell at the low? It's not so much now, but when I was coming up in the late 80s and the 90s, Oklahoma City, they'd be clicking along 5,000-6,000 head. And when that wheat ran up a flag leaf and turned blue, they'd have 25,000. And most of the time, the cattle weighing 8 1/4 didn't bring very much more than a 7-weight would have in March.
How much of it has to do with the fact that we're playing a different game? I think the game that a lot of people are playing is what looks good on the market report when everybody's looking at the market report. Everybody's checking out the market reports in October and November. And so I want to have my name in there, and I want it to look good next to everybody else's names, rather than I want to be the most profitable I can, no matter when that means I sell.
Yeah. I call that the 2 E's: ego and emotion. Business in its best form should be utterly emotionless. And it's hard not to do, and anybody that knows me, I had a neighbor. He ran the front end of the front ends, and generally we were both grazing wheat. Well, if they got mixed up, we kind of pushed them in a corner, and we're going to try to sift them out horseback. And he had a hand with him. I had 2 of my kids with me, and he goes, all right. He said, "What's the mark and what's the brand?" And Carl said, "They don't need to look at that." He goes, if they're good, put them through the gate." He goes, "And if they're not, they're Kent's." I'm like, that kind of hurts. It's the truth. It turned out it was mostly the truth. I was like, no, I did steal a good one right there. He's mine. Look at the brand. But those cattle made a lot of money. And there's a lot of people like, man, I guess social pressure, peer pressure. I'll consult with somebody and I tell them, look, you're probably going to grow a lot of weeds, a lot of forage, and your neighbors are going to comment on it. And I'm going to tell you that up front. And we've all had customers like, man, I had to spray. I couldn't stand looking at all those weeds. And okay, it's your place. Get after it. But yeah, people they'll either panic, when the market kind of took a pretty stiff dive in August. And I told lots of people the futures market was giving you $150 to $200 premium. You could sell an 8-weight calf all last winter, spring, and early summer, up until we got ready to sell them. You could sell them on the board of trade, $150, $200. Well, they jerked about 150 of that 200 out in a week. And what I call the chicken littles, the sky's falling. Well, hey, when do you think this thing's going to come back? And I'm like, I don't know. If I knew that, I probably wouldn't tell you, but I don't know. And I asked him, but what did you do for 4 months? Because it's too late. The term I learned that when I was trading grain was fishing behind the net. You don't usually catch much.
Right.
And that gets down to discipline. And again, and it's all connected. We've all been taught, educated. If you want to study something, take one single piece of it. But it's all related. The panic, well, that's related to your lack of discipline. It gets dry, you got to sell early. That's related to, it's all connected. But I would say, and for 35 years, and I've never understood it. I don't know. I had one of my mentors in the grain trade told me early on, he said, look, you can forget all that about supply and demand. There is 2 things that make a market work, and that's fear and greed. And this guy was a big grain trader. And he goes, people sell because they're scared and they buy because they're greedy. I'm not faulting them. He goes, I've been both of them. He goes, I've been both of them in the same day. Fear and greed and lack of discipline. If you know your costs and you sit down and I think a lot of it is that they think, okay, if I contract my cattle, if I hedge them and it goes up. I helped a guy for several years, and if we sold cattle and the market went up $2, first thing he would say is, oh, man, we should have held him another week. And I asked him one time, I said, look, if $2.40 a pound was good last week, if it wasn't good last week, what makes it good now?
Yep.
You can't get it. That's what it is. And he goes, call that guy back up. And I'm like, no, I'm not. You can call him and look foolish. I choose not to. If you had told him I'll take $2.40 for the cattle, and he said no, and the market went up $5, and he called you back and said, hey, is that $2.40 still good? That sounds kind of foolish. And to quote another guy that I used to talk with, I think the guy's name's Scott Shellady. One of his sayings was, only one person buys at the bottom and only one person sells at the top. And it's probably not going to be you. I mean, you go to picking a top, and that gets back to, well, we did everything we could. We couldn't have sold them any higher, so we don't need to. It doesn't matter what our cost of gain was, because that's as good as it could get. Discipline. I read somewhere several years ago, the root word of discipline in the Latin is to teach. As in, think discipline, disciple. The root word for punish is to hurt. So if you have discipline, you're trying to learn. If you already know, and then you're going to get punished, and it's going to hurt.
What are some of the keys to having discipline, or what does discipline look like to you when you're talking about being disciplined?
Again, not to harp on it, don't be greedy. And I can understand if you're a cow-calf guy, but you pick a spot. I mean, mine for years and years, and still is, when I can make $100. I don't know that I'm going to sell him, but I'm going to start looking. And at least in the yearling business, that is, okay, if I sell him, make 100, what can I buy to replace him? Essentially sell by marketing. And I realize a lot of people don't like going to the sale barn. They think it's a den of thieves, and some of them are. But it's like, okay, I'm going to sell him. And you decide, and I have a pretty good idea what I have in him. I will get a good idea of what he weighs, to include running him across my chute or load him in a trailer and go weigh him. If you think you're going to sell him, take 2 hours, cut the middle out of your calves, and figure out what they weigh. Because I've seen a lot of people, oh man, I think those cattle weigh 8. Well, when they sell them, they weigh 740, and that kind of changes the figures. But number one, figure, I put a profit in my budget. When my break even has a profit in it. That being said, like I've said before, at least in the stocker business, and you can mitigate it, but to some degree, sooner or later, you're going to have to pick up a set of dice and roll them. It's a gamble. You're betting on the rain, you're betting on the calf's health, and you may be doing it for 5-6 months out. But you can minimize that bet. But to be able to sit down and say, okay, if I could get this for these cattle, is that a good deal? Independently, not if I get X for these cattle and then the market goes up $5. If it's a good deal, it's still a good deal. And that gets back to the cow-calf people maybe sitting there and say, okay, do I wean them? Do I not? Do I wean them for 60 days? Do I take a 5 weight to a 7? And it is confusing, and a lot of people are scared of sale barns, and they're scared of the futures market. But that's not. I don't buy that excuse. I mean, there are people that can help you. There is a lot of good people at sale barns, and I know a lot of them, and they'll help you. And again, but I mean, you can. It doesn't take a lot. I mean, for the seasonality. I mean, it's not even the low hanging fruit. It's laying on the ground. All you got to do is pick it up. Maybe you move your calving dates to May instead of February. I don't know why people calve in my country in February, let alone in yours. It's for a great big soggy calf that nobody wants in October. And I don't know if the guy will do it. I had a client. Like, what if you went to May? Number one, you're going to do away with all that feed you're feeding your wet cows from February to May. Well, I'm going to have a smaller calf. And I said, hear me out. What if you kept them until the next March? Then you're selling a 6 weight when everybody wants one. And I said, send them 2 loads of weaned 6 weights, 15th of March, when everybody needs 400 a week and they're getting 200. And I said, you will like it. That is my definition of a very fun day.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. We've been fortunate to feature a number of Understanding Ag's regenerative farming and ranching experts on the podcast over the years. In that time, Understanding Ag's reputation for helping producers understand and successfully and profitably apply money-saving regenerative principles and practices has only grown. And there are 2 primary reasons for that. First, Understanding Ag's consultants are farmers and ranchers who've been there, done that on their own regenerative farms. And second, Understanding Ag's consultants aren't in the business to sell you costly inputs. They get no commissions and you get no pressure. Just profit-building solutions for your operation. Learn more at understandingag.com and discover the hope in healthy soil. That's www.understandingag.com. Your description of discipline, just to illustrate the point, is the opposite of what I did last night while I was watching election results that I couldn't control anyways, but I was still watching them. And I said, you know what? I got to drive tomorrow. I'm going to go to bed at 11. And then 11 came and, well, maybe one more state. And then it was 11:40 and I'm like, okay, no, I really got to go to bed now. So, I mean, but that's what you're talking about with discipline. This is the target. When I can make $100, I'm going to start looking to sell these calves, and we're going to stick with that. We're not going to say, oh no, well, now it looks like I could make 150 if I just, or whatever. I'm understanding what you're saying, right?
Absolutely. And I'm not saying, you get to the end, I've kept cattle, but I had a good reason. And the other thing, and I know a lot of people, I'm going to read this quote, and this has to do kind of with maybe with markets, but particularly with the Board of Trade. And it's from a move, I wrote it down years ago. Fear is not real. The only place that fear can exist is in our thoughts of the future. It is a product of our imagination, causing us to fear things that do not at present and may not ever exist. Do not mistake this with danger. Danger is very real, but fear is a choice. It is a story that we tell ourselves. And I can't remember, quite frankly, not knowing something about the board. But even if you don't, there are people, and you may have to pay them, that can explain it to you and help you. And if you don't, I personally don't like LRP, livestock risk protection, because I know the board, I actually kind of like doing it. My problem never was, Clay, that I didn't want the dice. My problem was I walked in and said, give me those things. I want to roll them. Yeah, that's the discipline I had to learn. And to quote my mother, the good Lord will give you a lesson until you learned it, and he will repeat it until you learn it. At which point, the only thing you get is another lesson until you die. I had to get a lot of lessons early on. Let's just say I had to repeat a lot of classes.
He was developing discipline.
Yes. But I mean, livestock risk protection, and I'll say this, I started studying it for our marketing school. We had 8-9 months ago. I'd never used it. So I used it. I would maybe tell everybody, find somebody that either is somebody that doesn't know what they're doing has used them, or find my guy. And the reason I trade with him is he runs cattle and he uses it. I got a lot of misinformation when I started checking it out. But, and again, is it going to cost you money? Yes. But I had an acquaintance, let's call him. He had 6 figures made in his summer yearlings, and he did nothing, and he smoked up nearly all of it. I mean, he went from making 250 a head to 60. And he's like, well, I'm not going to sell my cattle for that. And I'm like, the guy's buying them. He said, why'd that deal go down? I said, well, it probably went down $150 because the guys that were buying your cattle and feeding them were losing $150. I'm going to say that's number one. And I said, you were trying to find the top. And I asked him, I said, look, he goes, well, that'd have been $30 or $40. And it is. But I thought of this today, studying on this. Nobody, you may look at your check, you get to check your check from the sale barn, look at it, think, good grief, it cost me $35 a head to sell them. I call the guy that sells on the video, and it's about $35 or $40 to turn one to money. If you enlist, whether it's an auction house, video sale. So everybody, we're good with that. Well, it's the cost of doing business. So I would maybe sit down and ask yourself why that's okay, because you're going to spend it. But if you don't mind spending $35 or $40 to sell one, what's wrong with spending $25 or $30 to put a floor under them? And a lot of times, most of my hedging or risk management, it's kind of at the bottom. I don't mind playing with my profit, but yeah, I don't want to give away somebody my shooting marble.
So one of the things that stuck out to me from going through the Soil Health Academy was, and it's been said multiple times on the podcast too, was that the vast majority of ranches in this country are overstocked. You've mentioned that here as well, that the vast majority of ranches are overstocked. And I think, do you see that being one of the major factors in the way people plan to market?
Absolutely. If you're out of grass, again, the seasonality. Years ago, we were buying short and solid bred cows, and it didn't work very well for either one of us. But my buddy told me we were done. He said, I think my problem was I was figuring on an inch of rain about every week in June and an inch every 2 weeks in July and August. And I looked at him. I'm like, say that again, kind of slow. Maybe that was the problem. If you're jammed up, if you run out of grass, it starts cool nights, grass quits growing, all of a sudden it's like, oh, my cows are losing a little condition. We got to sell the calves. Excess capacity. It's a wonderful thing. And for years I was like, yeah, I'm not going to leave that stuff out there for cover. I'm going to eat it. I'm going to turn it to money. And through no fault of my own, entirely accident, I sold a set of cattle for a really good price. I'm like, okay, didn't get anything bought, rocked along, it got dry. And lo and behold, about 4 months later, I was the only one that had grass. And I can tell you, that was a fun trip to the sale barn too. Everybody said, what are you going to do then? Like, I'm turning down some grass. I hadn't anything on all summer. Well, why'd you do that? And I'm like, I don't have, well, I actually lied and told him, I'm like, oh, that's part of the plan all along. and maybe you don't use it. But I mean, if you're up against the wall that tight that you have to eat every blade of grass, operate at 98% efficiency, it's probably not going to work at some point anyway. And it's worth saying, I talk bad about people that feed lots of hay. I have never counseled anybody to not keep hay around. I will buy a lot of hay when it's cheap. And it kind of about the same time, I'm like, wow, what's the difference between that hay and that grass standing out there? I mean, quite frankly, I got paid more for that standing grass in September, October, and November than it would have made me grazing it when it was green. Does it every year? No, but sometimes we tend to remember the one or two times in 10 years that it worked good, and sometimes we remember the one or two times that it didn't, just depending on our context and our point of view.
Well, and theoretically, right, the cow is better at taking care of the calf than we are, and the calf will do better when it's on the cow than it will off the cow. And so if we've got this excess capacity, then we can run them on the cow longer and maybe hold those calves born in May until March when everybody wants one, and we can sell, like you said, 2 loads of calves to those guys that need 4. And that's a fun day, right? So, I mean, it goes back to all of it being connected.
And there's times a year, if you calve in the fall and say you're stripping them and shipping them in the spring, you're probably not going to get paid to precondition your cattle for 2 reasons. Number one, it's pretty easy to do on green grass. Number two, it's not October. And number 3, they're usually so high that nobody is going to give you 10 cents, 100 more. It doesn't matter what you do unless you roll up a $10 bill and stick it under their tail, in which case they may pay you 8. But I mean, so again, it's a seasonality. I usually turn and start talking to the guy next to me. If I'm buying cattle in February or March and they run some preconditioned cattle in there, I'm not going to pay you any more for it. And if I'm selling them, I don't expect to get paid any more for it. It's kind of like, with you mentioned a market report, and the guy told me, he said, every time I read that market report, and the guy had good cattle, and he goes, and I hold my cattle there, they never bring what that market report said. And I asked him, I said, so how many years do you have to do that your cattle bring 10 cents a pound less than the market report before you just start figuring they are going to bring 10 cents a pound less? This is, from what you told me, this is not the first time it happened. It's not the 5th time it happened. And it's not so much now, but a lot of those, back in the 90s, when I was in the working in sale barns, the guys then that wrote those reports, They were influenced by the people that owned the barn, most of them. And they were with them. They were with friends, and you run a set of cattle in. They were tanked. They were full. They didn't bring anything. They turn around and say, "Hey, don't put that on the market report." It's a lot more scientific now. But I would say too, if you don't know what your calves are going to bring, go to the sale barn and eat lunch and sit there for 2 hours. Sit and watch. And I've probably got 10, 15 order buyers numbers in my phone. I can call them, "Hey, what could I run in the ring that would make you sit up and start looking?" Well, this time of year, they're going to say a thin, good, weaned 500-pound steer. And I'll tell them, "Well, he wasn't good when I bought him, so you're probably not going to like him now, and I'm not going to sell a thin one. But I can't get him weaned." And there is sad fact, sale barns are kind of a magnet for this, maybe the livestock marketing industry in general, not just sale barn. And I would say, I don't have anything against the sale barn. I sell 90% of my stuff through one. But the livestock marketing business tends to attract people who will surprisingly and sadly not tell the truth for a little money. I would say guard your reputation. I have sold a lot of people cattle, and they were nearly violently angry because they didn't like them because they weren't good enough. And I asked them, "Well, then why did you buy them?" "Well, because I know if you said they're straight, Donica." And that was it.
You mentioned earlier fear, and I read this earlier today. Write down your fears of what might happen in the next however amount of time it is. Reread and check in on those every few weeks or months, whatever the period of time you're dealing with is. And it will be a constant source of relief to you when you see that your fears are not, in fact, coming true. And then you might want to start asking, why did you have those fears? What was the information that was causing you to get fearful? And I think that's just, goes back to what you were talking about, fear not being real, and don't be governed by it. And it's almost impossible to make a good decision when you are being governed by fear.
I would agree. And back on the selling and the hedging, maybe not being greedy. And this is a long time ago. I tell this story a lot. I had a big set of summer cattle, and they hadn't done very good. I had a guy that was supposed to be taking care of them, and he wasn't. So I put them in a grow yard, and we started feeding them. They had the age. They were thin, and they exploded. Guy running the grow yard told me, he said, "These things are getting too fat." And I knew the guy, and he was good. And he goes, "We need to sell them." And I remember, I'm fixing to date myself. We got $1.15 for them. And I didn't want to take it. I didn't have it. And then I said, I'm like, why is this making me mad? These cattle are making money. This was a horrible deal 60 days ago. And so we sold them. All the cuts to the city, they bring $2 or $3 more. And I was like, wow, I should have told that my cuts bring more than my good cattle. That was on a Monday. Well, I went to the stockyards. I got roped into work, and I come home, sleep in Tuesday, and I get up and I watch those planes crash into the World Trade Center. I'd sold them on September the 10th of 2001. Those cattle the next week wouldn't have brought $1, and the week after that, they probably wouldn't have brought 75 cents. And I tell people, it's like, "How'd you know?" And I'm like, I didn't know. I guess I was trying to kill myself, and Jesus looked down and said, "Nope." I said, "Not today, Kent." That's the only explanation I have. But after that, I thought, I do not want to be there. I do not want to be there the next time that happens. Nearly identical thing happened in 2003 when they found that BSE cow.
Yeah, and I think that if you set yourself up to let it happen, you can become a victim of the market, and that's why, the bottom of the triangle for Bud Williams, right? Grass and money.
Yes.
The grass and the money. If you got grass and money, then nobody's ever gone broke because they had too much grass and too much money. There's been a lot of people that have gone broke because they had too many cattle.
At the wrong time.
Right. And so if you've got 3 months of grass ahead of you, or 3 months of cash in the bank, or 3 months of hay in the yard, and September 11th hits, you can ride it out. And so I think those, just avoiding getting painted into a corner is probably the biggest thing that I'm hearing you stress here today.
Yep. What's the line from the movie, the football movie? Stay mobile, agile, and hostile. Don't be a fixed target. And we've talked about marketing calves, but if my numbers are right, most cow calf operations derive 18 to 20% of their gross income from their cull cows. I want to talk about seasonality. I've got several calls. My cows brought $1.02, man. Those things were $1.40 last spring and summer. Again,
it's almost like the July 4th hamburger market affects the market on what cull cows are worth. It's almost like that.
Wow. Yeah. That's an interesting thought.
It's like that seasonality thing.
And then whoever gets the school lunch program and they get a couple million pounds of hamburger in storage, and then all of a sudden they're like, you know what? We don't need these things. Let me rephrase that. They don't need them at $1.40, but they can find a home for them. I think there's what is it? CattleFax says buyers will need to be incentivized. That's a nice way of saying they're going to bid you off $10. But I told this guy, I'm like, wow, are you kidding me? And he goes, are you serious? You didn't know that? And I'm like, no, I've watched it melt down. And he goes, well, you've got some cows. And it was kind of a source of local. I get rioted because I've told most of my neighbors around here and people that I deal with that if they gave me a cow, I'd sell her and go buy 2 yearlings. Guys like, is Bradshaw's cows in on you? You got cows? I'm like, no, they're actually mine. I bought them. Why? I'm like, because I like money. And he goes, what are you going to do with those cows? I'm like, well, I weaned the calves. Those were all short and solid and old cows. I weaned those calves and sold the cows. And he goes, how did you know? And I'm like, the same reason I know Santa Claus is coming the 25th of December. And I said, this is not the first year this happens. They go down every year. And he called me some dirty names that I won't say on your show and called me rude. And I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, it's every time. And I said, but what if you kept your cows and maybe put a bull with them, turn them in with your bull pasture, keep your bulls happy, keep them from getting out or crippling each other, and sell them in the spring? And he said, and I quote, well, I don't have enough hay or grass. I can't do that. I'm like, there it is. Good luck. And I said, but I told him, my wife, this is a joke with my wife. I told him, I said, look, I'm not on the boards of the Psychic Friends Network, but I can guarantee you that cows will be higher in April next year than they are next October. So maybe remember it.
Yeah.
Okay. Andy.
I was just talking to a guy who brought a good chunk of a semi-load of his own cows home yesterday because they didn't bring enough. And he said the one that was in good rig, she brought good money. These ones were young and Herefords and a little thin, and they did not bring good money. And so I just loaded them up and brought them home. And he, if everything goes right and they work out like the one that was in good shape, that'll pay, I'm sure. But I think sometimes we have to be willing to do things like that too, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, again, the mobile and agile. And I spoke back in the spring at a symposium in the Southeast, and quite frankly, a lot of them, I'm not going to say names or location, but they were basically just whining. We're not getting paid enough for our calves. And so the second day, this guy, he goes, we just got to figure out, how are we going to make money and survive? And guy that knew me, he said, what are you going to do, Kent? I'm like, I don't know. And I said, this may be the part where I get run out of the state with somebody chasing me. But I said, guys, I've made a lot of money in the cattle business. And it gets kind of quiet. And the guy's like, how'd you do that? And I said, by not doing the same thing every time. And I said, if you don't like what you're doing, please tell me why you keep doing it. And I said, if I haven't made you mad yet, it'll be unanimous. I'm buying your cattle. Are some of them mistakes? Yes, mistakes in handling them. I had one guy, guy was quite adamant that if you left your calves a bull till they were 600 pounds, that you would get enough weight to take the discount. And I told him, not if I buy them. And I said, you know what? I think I said this before. You know what the term forced equity is? Forced equity in real estate is, Clay, if you and I buy a house for $100,000 and we put $25,000 in it and it suddenly becomes worth $150, we just forced $25,000 in it. In the cattle business, forced equity is 2 testicles on a 550 to 600 pound calf. I can I can make him worth $150 more in 30 days with a knife or a rubber band.
Yep, for sure.
You sit down and look. And I think a lot of people in our business too, there's things we'll pay for. Gets back to the cost of risk management and the sales commission. Nobody gripes, man. I didn't want to spend $40 to sell them, but a lot of people, it's kind of the same deal. They keep doing the same thing, and they don't get paid for it, or they don't know they got paid for it. Sit down and say, okay, what if I did this? And that gets back, to the fear. Well, what if it doesn't work? Well, sit down and make no mistake. I have a book somewhere with pages, and wrote on the book is things I will never do again. There's a lot of them. I've been around long enough. There's a lot of them.
I think you should write that book. I think that should be Things I Will Never Do Again by Kent Donica.
It's just a long profane list, and most people would look at it and say, why did you ever do it in the first place? But adapt.
Yep.
And I told this group, I said, look, maybe it's not a mistake in handling. I mean, the one guy said, well, I cut my calves. And I'm like, but if you're selling them in October, it's hard to keep one alive. And this was in the Southeast. And he goes, well, all of ours go out of state. And I'm like, that doesn't fix anything. A 12-hour truck ride makes things worse, not better. And I said, what if you kept them? I mean, there was a guy there selling a program. They were wanting cattle to feed. And in the way down in the Southeast, they were offering 12 over the board for a 700-pound steer. And there was a group of us talking. And when the guy said that, I'm like, wait, say that again? And he goes, did that get your attention, Oklahoma? And I said, yes, sir, it sure did. And somebody goes, why? And I said, because I can't get 12 over in Oklahoma. And I told him, I'm like, guys, if I was 200, 300 miles closer, I'd be leasing land. That's a license to print money. Guy came up the break and he said, thank you. He goes, I've been trying to get people to do this for 3 years. And I said, man, you want to move to Oklahoma? We'll be friends. He goes, how about you move to Georgia? And I'm like, no, I ain't going to Georgia.
What are some other things? We talked a little bit before we got going. You had a list of things that were on your mind. Some other things that we haven't touched on today.
Well, I mean, I had on my list too. I mean, if you go to figuring your costs, and again, that's a big deal. They're like, where do I start? And this is not new with me. I didn't do it this way for a number of years, but my colleague Bert Teichert finally wore me down. He's a wonderful guy. And somebody said, why'd you quit arguing with him, Kent? I'm like, because I got tired of losing. And, Burke is a legend up north, probably a legend everywhere. He had a reputation for making unprofitable ranches very profitable, very quick. And what he taught me was you separate your fixed cost and your variable cost. And again, I'm not plugging we go into this in great detail in our schools. In other words, you pick up your tractor, you don't put it on your budget because that's the confusing part. Figure it, your variable cost. Okay, I'm going to put feed, I'm going to put hay in him, I got meds, I got vaccine, I got pasture rent. More on that in a minute. And then you see how much they made just against your variable costs. And then you go look at your fixed costs, your overheads, he calls them. He calls variable. Burke will tell you he doesn't like the term fixed cost because it implies you can't change them. And then he will look at you and say, but you can sell them. Then you sit down and say, okay, this is what I've got to pay my fixed costs with, my land, my tractors, my pickup. And obviously if you got to, if you're cutting your own hay, obviously the baler and the mower and the rake, they go against the hay enterprise. And then you turn around and Bert claims that if you allocate your fixed costs early, that you will invariably not do it right. If you put it on your break even list. And I don't have a lot of stuff. I don't like mechanicking. I hate flats. I would much rather shoe a horse than fix a flat. Just do your variable costs. I mean, I was on a place, and it wasn't a consult, but I was happened to be there, and the guy's kind of trying to egg me on, about that regen ag. Well, that wouldn't work around here. I'm like, you're absolutely right, because if you don't think it will, it won't. It will be a miserable failure. But I said a lot of it is kind of how you think, looking at things different. And he said, like what? And I said, well, like for instance, and it was a fairly good sized farming operation, a guy and his nephew. And I said, there's two of y'all, both your wives work in town, right? Yep. And I said, but you've got 4 late model, mid-size front wheel assist John Deere tractors, 3 of which have front end loaders in your shop. And I said, if there's just 2 of y'all, if you keep one for when a breakdown, what's the other one for? Because you can only drive one unless you just really don't like hooking and unhooking equipment. You can only drive 2 of them at a time. You got one apiece. What's the other 2 for? And he's sitting there looking, and they don't say anything. And then one of them's wives goes, that's a very good question, and I'd like to know the answer. I mean, it's how you think. And maybe the other thing is, I don't think people in the cattle business spend enough time. This is what I'm fixing to tell you. I think they call it executive link in ranching for profit. And that is, you sit down and you show everybody your numbers, and you let them beat on you with the big hammer. If you can't defend it, maybe you do need to change.
Yeah, I think that it all comes down to doing everything short of sin to not be managing in a crisis. You just have to do what you can to avoid that. And I think part of that crisis that we need to avoid managing in is the tax bill. And if we're going to spend $150,000 or more on a tractor to avoid paying $10,000 or whatever it is in taxes, that might not make a whole lot of sense.
I cannot improve on that. And that tax bill. I describe that tax bill as a large caliber handgun that most people point at their feet, and most of us have really, really good aim when we cock it. And make a mistake, I'm not saying I like paying taxes. I don't. I'll state I don't. But if I do it, I don't finance it. It's a cash sale. I'm not going to go spend $50,000 on 4 payments of $12,500 to save $20,000 this year.
Yep.
I'm done. It's paid for before I depreciate it, or I'll pay the taxes. And, I kind of did that, and I bought everything I need and thought I needed. And my CPA told me for years, and the guy was a rancher, and he goes, go buy anything you think you'll need, but when you don't need it, just pay the taxes. And I did in 14, I guess. Yeah. And I was like, okay, I'm ready for this. Well, 14th of April, I wrote the check. I discovered I was not as ready as I thought. But when the fall of 15 rolled around, and I had a chunk of change, and I walked into my banker and I'm like, look, I'm fixing to get a $75,000 speeding ticket. And he goes, no, that can't be right. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not Stephen Hawking, but I'm pretty good at arithmetic. That's right. And he goes, no, it's got to be bigger than that. You're wrong. And I'm like, no, that's it. Here it is. I said, that's the bad news. The good news is, let's pull it out of my savings and put it on that note. I had a lot of cattle in the feed yard, and guy was trading. They called me up, and it got pretty bad. And I was hedging them. I was sending, you know what a hojo is, Clay?
Howard Johnson?
Nope. It's a Holstein Jersey cross.
Okay.
And a lot of them in the feed yard. I was sending them away in 3 and selling them away in 14. They were in there a year. Some of them, when I put them in, I had to wait to hedge them. And I was so clicked along. Well, of course, 13 and 14, they were the things making 300 apiece. Again, they just wanted cattle. We really don't care. They'd start off telling you, well, a dairy cross is $10 back of the Panhandle market. Well, if they needed cattle, you tell them, I think a Holstein should be 2 back. And they'd say, okay, we don't like it, but we'll pay you 2 back. Yeah, that ended in 15 pretty abruptly. Well, I was hedging them, but I was maybe 75, 60 to 80% hedged, making $40. The problems arose quickly when 60 to 80% of them were making 40, and the other 20 to 40% was losing 500. Anyway, my guy called me up and we'd had some problems with the packer paying us. And I said, I'm done. And he goes, I got good news and bad news. I'm going to start with the bad. And he goes, well, you're upside down about $250,000. And I thought I was going to pass out. I was like, okay, I made a big mistake. And I told him, I said, proceed immediately to the good news. And he said, you got 280,000 in your hedge account. What do you want to do? I called him a dirty name and said, you almost caused a wreck. I'm like, how about you get yours and send me the rest? That was kind of like that September 11th deal. Did I know it was going to melt down? Yeah. And I mean, and there was some signs. I mean, the bridge, there was boards falling off the bridge.
But if you look at the cattle cycle, it does tend to be about every 10 years. That was 2014, 2015, and here we are again in 2024, 2025. What do you think's coming in 25, 26? Seasonality. We just pay attention, look at the history, look at the market reports, and I think it will help you make decisions a lot of times.
Yeah, and I mean, and there's times I will get greedier at times than other times, and that's in that book I was talking about. A lot of the things in that book could be attributed to the simple fact that I got greedy and stupid at the same time, and that is a bad combination. I can deal with either one, but you put them together, that's a bad deal. So I'll make it a point. If I'm thinking I'm going to get greedy, and again, I'm not saying that like it's a bad thing. If I'm thinking, okay, I want more for these cattle, I need to maybe check the good sense meter.
Do you have people that you will run those things by, or how do you make sure you're looking at it objectively?
I do. I guess an accountability group, people whose opinion that I value. And sometimes our arguments and conversations get quite animated, and they call me also. And that was one of the first things I figured out pretty early from working and hanging out at an auction. I had a sister-in-law, and she asked me, she goes, why would somebody as smart as you hang around a sale barn? And I said, well, you take Oklahoma City, there's probably 7 or 8 million a week goes through the place. There's a lot of information that goes to go with that money. And I said, and contrary to apparently most of the people that you met at a livestock auction or in the livestock marketing business, there's a lot of really good, honest people. This has been 30 years ago. There was a outfit up in Nebraska. Every February they'd come to this country and they would buy 20,000 6-weight heifers. And you could run them till the heifers bring more than this. If they got on one, they were going to buy it. And I was working at 2 sales, and guy was buying for both of them. And anyway, one November, we were sitting in the cafe, and Jimmy goes, man, these 3-weight heifers are nearly for free. He said, that's what so-and-so is going to want in March. And he goes, I wish I could find somebody to buy these 3-weight heifers and just feed them back to me in March. And I looked at him and I said, I know a guy. I do, Jim. And I said, he'd probably do it if we could find an honest order buyer. But I said, this place is kind of like Sodom and Gomorrah. I said, do you know somebody that could buy that do a good job buying them? That's all we said. The next week he buys me 80 of them. And that deal worked. That was one of the deals that did not go in the book. I think too, maybe some of it. And, when early on when I met Gabe, somebody said something about looking foolish. And Gabe laughed and told him in front of 20 people, he said, I look foolish enough. He goes, after a while, it doesn't get to bother you. Read a quote from a guy named James Clear. He said that, you have to come down off your perch and maybe look a little foolish to learn something.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Appreciate the wisdom and just practical insight you shared today. Anything else that you want to say before we wrap up here?
I would kind of related to, and this is more of a stalker deal, but it applies to pretty much anything. And again, we teach this in our class too. You get paid for 3 things. Pretty much in any business. Number 1, you get paid because you are very good at something and you know how to sell it. I'm good at a shipwrecked Kiwi that's been on a truck for 10 hours, and I'm good at it. And I'd like to think I know how to get paid for it. Number 2, you get paid for assuming risk. So going back to what I said earlier, second, you separate that calf from that cow. You were in the stalker business, and it's a different mindset. Generally speaking, with a set of cows, the less you can spend, the more you will make. All right, the stalker deal, it's a spread. I really don't care if cattle are cheap or cattle are high. I only think a 500-pound calf is high related to what I can sell him for weighing 8 and what it's going to cost me to put 300 pounds on. You're assuming risk, and that may be why a lot of people, they don't want to sell them. They sell them, and then the risk is over. You get paid to assume risk, and you need to understand it, and you can mitigate it, lessen it, or you can also make it a lot bigger. And the third thing you get paid for is just being lucky. And I had a kid, I've been mentoring somebody, he goes, so what do you do when you're lucky? And I said, okay, number one, I will cash the check with a big smile on my face. But I said, but the problem with a lot of people, and me included, it's nearly uncontrollable. Most people, when they become lucky, they'll think they did something good, and they may have, but you have got to separate the two. I mean, if you bought heifers in 20 in the pandemic, you were assuming a lot of risk, and you also got really lucky because they went up. Didn't really require a lot of skill. An up market does not require skill. It just requires time. When the deal starts flattening out, and my business, the way I see it, it's back to a weight gain business. It's back to, I better be sharp when I buy them. I better be sharp when I sell them. I better make sure that when I do sell, the weight I put on, it is for more than it costs me to put it on. We're back to business. The fun's over.
Yeah. And those skills that you need when the market's going down are the discipline, not being ruled by fear and greed, at least not at the same time. Some of those things we've already talked about, right?
Absolutely.
Yep. Very good. Kent, thank you for your time today.
Yes, sir. Hope I helped you and somebody else. Have a good day, Clay.
Very good stuff there with Kent. As always, really appreciate him taking the time to join me once again. And he's always a fun guy to talk to, entertaining stories and lots of experience and wisdom with regard to the marketing principles. Coming up next week on the Working Cows podcast, we'll be talking to Grant Vassberg. Grant has started a new company called Boss Sires, and they are seeking to help people source genetics that will work in their environment. Very interesting story to tell about how he got started with that and some of the things that contributed to his understanding of how to find genetics that work in anybody's environment. So we'll look forward to that coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.